Lucas, so big thing coming out of the Supreme Court this morning, right? Now Trump cannot be held in any ways responsible for what happened on J6. I didn't get a chance to look too much into this, so I'm really interested to hear your take on it and try to help us understand what's going on here.
Well, good morning, Rusty. Too. Yeah, the Supreme Court has been busy. There's a ton of, I would say, several cases that have a lot riding on them recently. Not least the latest, that the president is immune for some time with regards to prosecution. Um, I don't. Yeah, what do you what I mean we know that the
Well, what's the nuance here? I mean, or is there any? So essentially, this just says what that you can't like as a president, they just have blanket immunity for anything they're doing. But there's some stuff in here that seems like it couches the language a bit under official acts and things of this nature. I mean, is there anything to that? I mean, is it like was J6 an official act? It seems like that was a campaign rally. I don't. What was official about that?
well,
I
I don't
mean,
know.
I guess I'm just trying to understand if there's any nuance here. If this just says, well, the president can never be, indicted or done for anything. I mean, that's clearly not the case. Like, Watergate said that, presidents can definitely act in a way that is criminal or whatever, and that there can be things that they do. So I'm not sure exactly what we're learning here or what the nuance is. That's the piece that I'm kind of missing. Is there any couching of language, or is this like why is J6 particularly protected here? I mean, what official part of this is going on? I don't really fully understand this.
Well, I listened to some of the oral arguments in this case, but I have not read the decision in full. I just saw it 10 minutes before the show started. Um,
Well,
and
it's too breaking, so we'll just call it breaking news, and maybe
yeah, so
we'll say
that's
we'll say we'll come back later and give a more in-depth analysis because yeah, I didn't know how long ago this happened. I sort of had a pretty busy weekend, so I've not had a ton of time to catch up on everything that's going on, and yeah, and this happened this morning, right?
yes, and I mean, just largely, I would say that again, I talk about the difference between an adversarial and an inquisitorial system, because what is an official act? Like, that's a political question, and we seem to have this notion that um, the Supreme Court is not political. It's entirely political, and and we should accept that, and we should appreciate the structure of the federal judiciary, even if it's one person, or if it's 9 justices, if it's 14 justices. There's a group of people that need to get together and decide political questions, and what we saw. I mean, this also gets into, we had a discussion about Merrick Garland being held in contempt with Anna Paulina Luna, representative from Florida, and I said it was very, like, she knows her history and she understands some of the limitations of Congress, but even then I said I was not for the notion of Congress being able to hold a body in to incarcerate anybody. And I don't think that they should for Steve Bannon. I don't think that they should for Merrick Garland. I don't think that they should for Eric Holder. The Congress should be limited to paying for things and writing laws and seeing if anybody will follow them. The executive should be limited to recommending legislation. It should not be. I mean, we've seen the collapse of the payment for student loans, that is, and some of these other presidential. I mean, when Joe Biden says that he's the president and he's going to do it, there was a time whenever the president said, "I will come up with a great plan and recommend it to Congress and put the weight of the office behind it." But because in reality, that's some of the limitations of the president. And We also need to bear in mind that the Department of Justice, I mean, going back to Merrick Garland's hearing, so some of the questions put forth to him by Thomas Massey, like where in the Constitution does it authorize a special counsel of Jack Smith and these these digging into allegations against Donald Trump. Like at the end, there is no, like, truth is either decided by one person or a group of people, and this is how the justice system of the United States operates. So I've been impressed with the Supreme Court. Even what was the ruling last week, wherever when the standing ruling. Um, there's so many cases now I can't even think about it. Um, but I don't know. I don't know. It does that answer in a long-winded way, like that the Supreme Court has recognized that the office of the executive is political, and the judiciary system is also political, and there must be a buffer between them, or otherwise every president that we ever have will be subjected to lawfare. And
Yeah,
just
I think the only thing that used to occur is that there was maybe the illusion, or there was the supposed structure of this body that was supposed to be non-political or impartial. That was, I recall this being like the foundation of how the Supreme Court was supposed to exist, and why it was an appointment for life. Is we were supposed to go through these exhaustive, mechanisms of trying to find people that everybody could agree on, and that we had bipartisan agreement that they were the correct person to be on the bench. But
that's
maybe that was always an illusion, huh?
that was absolutely an illusion, and that was an illusion trotted out by by the post 1950s broadcast corporations. And are you familiar with Raytheon journalism? R Raeythei, whatever. It's
I, I'm
like the
I'm familiar with the company Raytheon. They're a defense contractor, right?
not Raytheon. Raytheon, the
Nope,
founder.
then I don't know it. I only know the defense contractor Raytheon.
Raytheon journalism is the man behind the BBC, I believe, was John Raytheon or something like that, probably Harold because he's British. But it was this notion that one person could tell both sides of the stories. No, that's not true. And as we've discovered, with these conversations about the mainstream media and alternative media sources, in reality, if you're telling a narrative about what's going on politically, it very much involves like your bags, your history, like aspects of your character, and that is not like assuaged by like it being a corporation or a conglomeration. Fox News is Rupert Murdoch's view of the world. The NPR is sort of like a New York City liberals take on the world, and that's not bad, but we shouldn't confuse ourselves and listen to these notions of like some solid truth that exists out there, and we're and nobody else's viewpoint meets the viewpoint of the teller of a narrative. And because in reality, if we are all citizens, then all viewpoints matter. And the Supreme Court, the justices are given or have a life tenure because it's political, not because it's not political, but because it's political. And so, because it is political, you want them to be as
The,
insulated
the,
from the myopia of politics as possible.
the Supreme Court, the way it's structured, to me harkens back to the original way that the country was structured, right? It's like it was originally that we would have these several states. The states would, put forth the senators, and those were the result of, the process that would happen in the various different houses of the bodies that governed each of the states. And so it was really a representative of the state, and that was supposed to be, this dichotomy that you had the people who elected Congress and then the states that elected the senators. And then you had these checks and balances in the way that the government was set up. And so, when we have, essentially the main legislative body then trying to come to an agreement about who should be on the Supreme Court and putting a check on those that are passing the laws and saying, well, we're going to try to ensure that there's a check on everything that's going on here. I thought that whole structure, had a lot of goodness to it, and some foundations of that have been, you know, plicked out kind of like a Jenga tower. It's like if you start messing around with some of the fundamental structures of how these things work, they can seriously undermine the long-term viability of the entire structure. So, this idea that we have populist senators, I think, takes us in the wrong direction. I think it's similar. When we think about how the president gets elected, we still have the electoral college. I think that would probably be a backwards move if we were to move away from the electoral college. Like there's some of these things that have real meaning, and it's hard to understand them unless you spend a lot of time digging into why these structures exist.
I mean, I 100% agree. And I mean, the original, like, we also ought to remember the jurisdictions that have that have changed in the history of the United States, especially with regards to the federal to the Supreme Courts and the federal court system. Originally there was one Supreme Court justice. I think that there was one Supreme Court justice for the first 50, 60 years of the Union of States, and that Supreme Court justice only was only tasked with reviewing fights between the states and or disagreements between states, and those disagreements were over commerce or over the movement of property between states, which is really, we have these also notions that seem to be forgotten about what the United States was supposed to be about. It was property rights, but it was also shared lands, and the lands were shared by the states. And that was a very different attempt at a republic than when we left off last week. Remember, we were having a conversation about native confederacies, the Iroquoian Confederacy, and the political system of the Americas that Europeans walked into. And there were some ideas that they were trying to emulate and put into a constitution or a political contract. Because even to go before the Constitution, we have the Articles of the Confederacy, and very much the states were given the jurisdiction over the bodies of the citizens that resided in those states, over the property that was held by the citizens that resided in those states, and the land and the real property that was attached to the land in those states. And we're seeing the Supreme Court return to that because, immediately after the Constitution, or not immediately, but very soon afterwards, the Supreme Court began to give itself power.
Well,
And
so along those lines, what's going on with the Chevron deference? Since we've got it in our title, it seems like that might be a good time to dig into that just a bit. Is this one where the SCOTUS is sort of walking back some other powers that seemed that they were delegated to some federal agencies, and now it's sort of been reining that in?
absolutely, Chevron deference, or the Chevron doctrine was uh, okay. So there that we have all of these three-letter organizations, or a number of bureaucracies, however we want to say it, and most of these bureaucracies fall under the executive branch. And again, the original notion was that the executive branch would be enforcing the laws made by Congress. Well, as the bureaucracies under and remember also what I said earlier about there was a notion too that the president would listen to the people, the vox populi, if there's such a thing, decide what the country needed and recommend legislation to Congress. but what that has devolved into was a creation of a number of bureaucracies, and most of these are after the Civil War. Um, and especially like after the progressive era of Teddy Roosevelt with all of the antitrust, Woodrow Wilson. These are the progressives, and then especially after FDR, another progressive. So, in order to solve problems of the United States, at the federal level, because of the I don't know, the slowness of an electoral decision, and also the limitations on Congress, because again, Congress is the power of Congress is to pay for things. So what we saw was a great like explosion in bureaucracies, and amongst those bureaucracies, this notion began to arise that even to give them independence from the judiciary, that they could have a rule making process. Like whenever you get into these bureaucracies, you get away from legislation, which is made by Congress, or laws, which are is what is de facto happening and what is enforceable, and maybe like a nod to what the court history of behind some notion or action is. And you get into rules, and so there's a rule making process, and they disseminate rules. And after that began to be commonplace, then they had their own arbitration bodies that could decide if and this goes to the
So,
SEC.
so if I got this in a nutshell with what was going on after the 1984 case, it essentially said certain federal agencies can start to make rules for how things should work, and what the Supreme Court said, that's not how it's supposed to work. You can't just delegate these powers to these acronymed entities to essentially make policy decisions. Is that it in a nutshell?
That in a nutshell, that's it. And the going back to the old reasoning of Chevron, um, the reasoning was, well, Congress is not well made to be making up the nuance of these rules and applying them to the particular places of the country. So we need a body to do that. Well, again, going back to the original design of the country, it should have been up to the states. There was also this notion that the states were going to be a petri dish of emergent order that had their own legislative bodies and their own constitutions. We were a union of democratic republics. Um, Now we say that there's one republic. Well, there was there going back to the Confederacy, it was a notion of a union of democratic republics, um, and those were the bodies who were supposed to be making the rules about corporations. Even
Well,
originally could not.
wait. Let me ask you a quick question here. So, in the last few decisions, we've had 6-3. Are most of these decisions all lining up sort of the same way? Is it do we have a stacked court here? Is that the current situation that we're in, where like the decisions that are coming down are mostly falling along, I guess, party lines? Is that
Well,
sort of what's going on here?
so I don't like to say party lines, because no, in the standing decision, it was there are different wings, but again, if you're talking about like merits, or if you're talking about
No, I'm just thinking we called it a political body, right? Like we said, hey, there should be no illusion that the Supreme Court is a political body. If the Supreme Court is a political body, then we should be able to, through the interpretation of, looking at some of these rulings and how we're seeing, factions gather together, then there might be some commonality in thinking here, right? And usually that's canonically what I would say parties mostly do, is they group together those who have similar thoughts and ideologies, and whatever patterns of how they want to govern or do things. And so I'm just looking at this, and as I start to try to synthesize what's been going on with the last few decisions. We're talking about presidential immunity, Chevron deference. We've had some other, major rulings that have come out in, I'd say, the last 2 months. Just trying to look back and say, okay, are we starting to see where, this court shapes up if we're starting to get similar rulings. But if you're saying, nope, there's been crossover, we've had people that have, voted different ways, I'd say that that's an indication of health. I like to see that, but if it's party line, then that tells us something as
Well,
well.
but the thing is, I mean, even parties, parties have different policies, different planks to their campaigns, and those policies are changing all the time. And the parties that everyone talks about the two-party system in the United States. Well, we have several planks in those parties, and those are always changing. Even the names of the parties, like, again, I call them the Progressive and the People's Party, because there have been like vast changes in the ideologies of those parties. Um, with the groups that the Supreme Court votes in, I would say they both like have notions of whether it is the government's the government's it is on the shoulders of the government or the private sector to do things, and this is sort of like ideas of liberalism. But then there is also the understanding of whether it's the jurisdiction of the federal government or the state governments. And you can see that with abortion and the nuance whenever you begin to pick that apart. We can have a Supreme Court who is a Supreme Court justice who is against abortion and would like to see a law that prohibits it, but wants to see that law at the state level because they understand that the jurisdiction of the federal government is commerce and the jurisdiction of a state is the bodies of the citizens that reside within it. Is that because going back to the censorship case that was ruled on standing, which is very interesting to see the liberal justices who like there was an older time in this country whenever Democrats were very concerned about the power of the federal government, or not so much the power of the federal government, but using the power of the federal government to ensure and to enshrine free speech. But you begin to understand at some point too that for the federal government to step in all the time, that it is up to that it I don't know, that there are powers of the states, and I don't know. Am I making sense here? Because the standing issue, like to have Roberts and Barrett and I forget who the third sort of quote unquote conservative justice were, but what they were saying was
Gorish or whatever his name is.
I thought Gorsuch was with Alito and Thomas. We have so many Supreme Court justices. But anyway, so that was a very interesting one because you saw, especially Roberts and Barrett, that were aligned with Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ketanji Jackson. So and it wasn't that anyone ruled against government censorship, but they did rule that it was up to that standing was important, and it wasn't the place of the Supreme Court to just be deciding willy-nilly all of these decisions.
Yeah, and I mean that's like one of the arguments against judicial activism, and the way that people have said sometimes the courts have been too much straying into making policy. And so like one of the things that is possible is to just say, hey, look, we're not even capable of hearing this case because the people who have brought the case in front of us aren't properly the ones who should be arguing this case. That's what we mean by standing, right? Is you got to actually have a stake in the game if you're going to come in and try to argue a case. You can't just be some outsider that doesn't have anything on the line.
Yeah, and that's absolutely crucial because you can imagine like in your life, like seeing something happen between two of your neighbors and running to a judge and saying, Mr. Jones down the street yelled at Mrs. Smith across, in the yard in the morning, and I don't think that's right. And any judge should turn around and say, well,
mind your own business.
Yeah, mind your own business. That's good advice from Benjamin Franklin. Mind your business. So yeah. Standing is a, I don't know, a crucial legal concept as well as jurisdiction, and it seems to me that we are beginning to. Oh, I was gonna mention also this notion of ex parte decisions. Have you seen ex parte or ex parte decisions whenever you see a Supreme Court case or federal cases?
I mean, I have seen the the words come across. Tell us a little bit about what that means and help ground it. And then I think we should get on to Kennedy. We should talk about that a bit.
Okay, sure. Well, an ex parte decision means that one of the bodies or the institutions under consideration or persons under consideration didn't show up. And this is why the Supreme Court has tribunals, because there was a notion, a lot of government is structured around the idea of who has the power to coerce. I mean, in a way um, that is really like what is at stake whenever we think about governments, and especially from maybe a libertarian values perspective. And there are many cases in the history of the Supreme Court that are decisions are issued ex parte, and that means that so say Missouri had a fight with I mean, even like the EPA or another state, and a case was held in the Supreme Court. Well, there was once upon a time where they might just decide not to show up, because it's in their mind the Supreme Court can issue a decision, but who's going to enforce it? And that used to be a great limitation on the decisions, and something that was in the back of the mind of every justice.
Well, that's also an interesting correlation to previous conversation that we had when we were talking with our judicial candidate, Nathan, who said, what happens when bodies that are intended to be enforcing laws just decide to set laws aside and not consider that they don't exist. It's like, whatever, like we don't think we need to honor this right now. We don't think we need to enforce this law. I think it's a very weird situation to be in where, federal agencies, bodies, or elected officials say, well, we're just going to ignore laws that are on the books. It seems like a very strange thing. But I hear you on, like, when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, like, who's actually going to make it take effect, because there's the ability to write words on paper, but then there's real power, right? And the real power is those who believe in the words you say and then are going to enact and act as if the words that you said are correct and that they have merit. And I guess that, the ones that ultimately are going to usually take what the Supreme Court says is the other judges, attorneys, and people who are in court. And so at the point when enforcement happens, I guess it's when the bailiff puts the cuffs on you.
Absolutely. And this is why I think it's also so very important to make a distinction between legislation or laws or things that get written down, rules that get written down by whether it be a bureaucratic agency or a group of elected officials who get together and think there's some great idea. Um, there's a difference between that legislation and the codification thereof, and what is actual law, and what is law is what is enforced. And this even gets to notions of, I mean, we could talk about the difference between a sheriff and a police officer. I'll just say quickly, a sheriff is both elected, and a sheriff gets to make that decision. A sheriff, you cannot tell a sheriff, like, this is written down, go out and enforce it. They are imbued with the authority to make that decision themselves, and that's what it means to deputize someone under the sheriff. They are given that authority to make the decision of which like legislation to enforce. A police officer is not given. A peace officer is not given that authority. The military is not given that authority. The role of the military is like you're making a deal, usually for money, or maybe just because of allegiance, going back to our notions of militia, and you're giving up your authority and you will follow orders. Policemen will also follow orders, but a sheriff is not. And that is also speaks to the paradigm that we use to establish the authority of the federal bureaucracies, because there are rulemaking bodies that exist in Washington, and then they have basically deputized like authorities in regional offices that exist across the country. And this is very important to understand, like how and why the financial like regulatory system works as it does, how the aviation regulatory system, the environmental regulatory systems work as they do. They're both paid, and this also gets into the CFP, the fight over the funding of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and how that was very different from the older structure in which the regulating bodies are paid by the people that they regulate. Why was it set up that way? Because there were people in Congress who didn't want them to have any power, and they understood that to limit the funding of federal authority was to hamstring it, and you could have it captured by the entities that it was regulating if they relied on those entities for their paycheck. So, but yeah, let's move on. Unless you have any questions about that.
Nope. I think we should touch on the Kennedy debate. Let's talk about it.
Well,
Okay, so first off, let's start with this because I think that this is one of the most interesting parts of what happened is just to talk about this first thing, which I'm going to throw on the screen right now. This right here really caught my eye. So I don't know if you saw the numbers for the CNN debate. Did you catch the number of how many people were watching
I
CNN?
think
It
I
was
think
like
it
what, 3
was
million?
no CNN. I think it was 48 million.
48 million.
Yeah, 47.9 million is the number that I saw.
Okay.
But still, 9 million is substantial with regards to how many people, and I would say that was probably with replays and whatnot, with the CNN debates, and that sounded like a real number to me, even though a lot of people I saw also like turned it off after 20 minutes because they were either bored or disgusted.
The 48 million, there was a massive drop off. I'm going to
I
try and talk for a second. Let me see if I can find what the official number was on the CNN debate.
Okay, well, so I think it was 47.9 million was what I saw, and with a steep decline in numbers after the first 20 minutes. Um, RFK Jr. I mean, 9 million may not sound like a lot compared to 48 million, but it's still incredibly substantial, and especially whenever you think about the number of okay, yeah, 51 million.
Well, I mean, you're right on. I mean, to me, mathematician, like, what's the difference between 48 million and 51 million? It's in the statistical noise. Who knows?
Well, but still, I think it's great to like have some ideas of like both. It's also important to look at how many people dropped out at 20 minutes from that CNN debate, what sort of exposure that Bobby Kennedy got. I thought the most profound
Well, the,
change.
well, the the interesting thing between these two, right? Just to sort of make sure that we're properly setting this up. This one was just straight up on cable TV. You know, if you're just clicking through the channels, you could have happened upon this, and it was being covered. You know, like it was being discussed. This was not being discussed. This was not being covered. You couldn't just casually surf to this. You had to decide you wanted to do this. You had to navigate to a specific website. You had to do extra things to even know that this was happening, right? I mean, it's not like, and what was interesting was when I was trying to come up with this number, you know, I just like wanted to throw that on the screen. I tried to do just a little bit of, you know, regular old Google searching, and look at this. Like, you know, when I search for this, which should have some number of articles. I mean, this is not news, right? We've been talking about third party candidates, and we essentially we haven't had a real strong third party candidate since I guess when Ross Perot was running. You know, so it's been a minute since we've had a strong contender. But if you look through just like the Google search results, there's almost no coverage of this at all. Like there's nothing. So it's shocking that like this isn't even being mentioned at all by mainstream media. Like it's almost a complete freeze out.
You know, going back to our conversation about politics and Raytheism journalism earlier, like uh, if you sit on it, if you sit on a city council, you'll notice that the most powerful thing that is given to the mayor is the ability to set the agenda. And that's something that those people in politics and in policymaking understand. That's something that people understand in media. So it's amazing that we have um, options. We have so many. I don't know. We're going through a revolution with regards to the dissemination of news and the ability for people to find information. It's amazing that RFK was able to put up a website and reach out to 9 million people. But also just like again a stark. I asked my father after the debate. I said, "Did you catch RFK?" He had no idea, no idea that that even existed. He's not somebody, he watches traditional television. That's how he consumes politics. He wasn't necessarily that
I
motivated.
agree with that. I had a chance to just, talk to people that I normally don't talk to. And interestingly, there was a lot of reception to talking about politics. I started just, casually directing the conversation in that direction. And they said, "This is great. Like normally we can't get anybody to talk about politics. So this is really interesting." And so I started asking a few questions about Kennedy and if they knew about it. And the only thing they knew about Kennedy was brainworm. That was the first thing that came up. I'm like, "Oh, okay, here we go. Like this is how things are being spun. It's like the only thing that can get said is like some, medical condition that a guy had that he got treated for. It's like this isn't like an indication that the guy is like off his rocker. Like, he had a legitimate medical condition."
Well, and also think too. I mean, both the policy differences between Trump and Biden are non-existent. Their differences are rhetorical. Their policy decisions are absolutely in line with large corporations, and what has been like the political campaign, the political discussion going on this year. We were coming out of COVID last time. People were locked in their homes. They were desperate for news, but even that was curried and combed. But when I was 20 years old, at this time I was exhausted by the amount of political ads and political discussions that were being held. And at this time this year, you barely know that we have an election coming. And there were no Democratic debates between the candidates. There were Republican debates, but
Well, it was attempted. I mean, when Kennedy first started his campaign, he wanted to try to capture the Democratic nomination, but that is not a process that allows for that. In an election year, it seems that the nomination of the candidate who's going to hold the Democratic spot is not an open primary. That is essentially what Kennedy said. He said, "This is not allowing me to run. This machine that exists inside the Democratic Party has already selected their candidate, and so that's why I have to run as an independent." I remember that being one of the first times that he announced as that he was going to run as an independent, because he said that this is not an open and fair process.
well, and again, so to me, the most I don't know, a shift in how we will see campaigns occur in the future was Bobby's, like the format choice of his inclusion, like grafted into the CNN debate, by having a camera, having something that mimics the view, the look of the CNN debate, and then pausing that feed and having him respond and answer that question. It was brilliant, both because it gave him space to address each of those questions. Starts at the same time, but then because it's pausing to give him and operates under the same rules. But then with the lag that's generated by the end, like I saw on his website, when the CNN debate ended, because Bobby Kennedy's debate was still going on and then had gained some amount of traction, I saw the numbers increase like by 33% on his website alone. It went up by several million. And I thought that was but like an amazing format choice that any candidate, uh, any third,
You think we're going to see this repeated, where like a
oh,
candidate who's
100%, 100%. I mean, what would Ron DeSantis have been able to achieve if he had not been mired in the political charades of idiots like, well, some of the other candidates who were not bona fide in their desire to run for president, and I say that
Well,
because
I think somewhat this is also the breaking down of just the way that traditional media has had a stranglehold on the ideas of the country. Right now, we're starting to see that, with the platforms that exist and the ways that video and live, streaming of anything can be done. We're no longer in the situation where you have to go to the big entities if you want to get a big audience. I mean, I think we've shown pretty demonstrably with platforms like X, and I think with some of the other, major live streaming technologies that exist, it's no longer only within the purview of broadcast television that you can reach a large audience. Like that's just, and that's really relatively recent developments.
true, and I mean, even look at I don't see a ton of politicians who are using X or other social media. I do see Matt Gaetz is live streaming all the time. In the 90s, the contract with America was on the back of Newt Gingrich, and Newt Gingrich understood that C-SPAN was going all the time, and that he could get down there and he could speak in front of that candidate, and it might only put him in front of 2 million Americans, but 2 million people is a lot, and especially whenever there's voter apathy. Um, uh, on election day, and even more voter apathy on 364 times 4, or 364 plus 365 times 3. That's pretty powerful to have those voices listening to you.
Yeah, if you can get in front of an audience that's active, that is going to spend money politically or is going to vote, that is an extremely important faction or set of block of voters that you need to get in front of. I think that's why, when the crypto issues started to finally come up and you started to see substantial movement towards Trump from, the crypto community, that's when Biden sort of had to stop and pay attention. Their whole crew had to say, wait a minute, if we're on the wrong side of, a substantial number of people who are, going to be motivated to not only vote, but potentially, you know, uh, contribute to campaigns, we're going to be on the wrong side of a big block. And if that's the case, then we might lose the election just on that. We're starting to get to be really, really balanced in a lot of crucial areas of the country that are swing states, swing districts, and whatever. And so really the balance of power kind of hangs, very, very closely in a lot of places. And that's also why I think Kennedy's campaign is being viewed by a lot as, this could be the decider campaign, because if it swings one way or the other, or he could potentially even win, like it's starting to look like the numbers are going very much in the direction of Kennedy. So, I don't think it's outside the bounds at all of, if what happened to Biden on stage where he couldn't coherently deliver a message, that's pretty hard to accept for a
Well,
sitting president.
I mean, and I would say that um, to hold up like Trump or Biden's performances with regards to Kennedy, also, I mean, what he did was just was a paradigm shift, and it also goes back to like FDR's fireside chats. Politicians talk all the time about this job. It's not a job; they're elected, and they do get paid, but they weren't always even paid. And in reality, if it is a job, the job is not to go make legislation. That's only part of the job. A lot of what that job, the role is. I just find it so funny that like we have begun to speak in terms of the electoral process and legislative process in terms of like commercial job. Um, a lot of what that is communicating to their constituency, and that is incredibly powerful to communicate to your constituency, and to be isolated in such a way as Bobby was with his response to the quote unquote debate that was going on. That was absolutely a much more bang for your buck in communicating to people who are like both his constituency and also his prospective voters. And I think that's also what we need to see more of. I love Tim Burchett, not because I agree with him, but because every day when he's walking out of a congressional hearing or off the voting floor, he has his phone on and he's filming like what happened. And that's what we need to see. Like that is, there's another there's another bureaucracy. The only bureaucracy that we have that's written into the Constitution is the post office. And that's because the founders of our democracy, or representative democracies or republics, whatever we want to call them, of our countries and our states, understood that communicating to the electorate was absolutely was required, foundational. It was necessary in order for representatives to turn around and have some sort of beneficial discussion about policy. And what Bobby Kennedy did was doing exactly that. So that's all I have to say about like the format. Let's talk about some of the details. Like what in oh, there goes my phone. What in the debate by either the major by Biden and Trump did you take note of, or by Kennedy? There were a couple of things that I thought were profound.
Um, so my first takeaway was I could not really understand when Biden was speaking. Any question that got answered, there was a lot of sort of just mumbling that occurred, right? And I've tried to go back and actually understand what he was trying to say, given the benefit of the doubt of like him answering the question and me just being open-minded about it, not just saying like whatever. But to me, I could not really understand a lot of Biden's answers. It seemed to me like he was trying to establish a train of thought and then got lost and then would say incoherent things. It was really hard to follow it. So I was watching it live on TV and then trying to catch up a little bit with what was going on with Kennedy. And I haven't had a chance to go back to exhaustively watching all of it. But like that was my takeaway was I had a real hard time understanding what was being said and trying to give him the benefit of the doubt for saying, okay, he does have a real response here. And I really couldn't parse it. And so to me, I coming out of that debate, I really couldn't even tell you what Biden's policies were. Things came up on immigration, and it sounded like a lot of things like what we're gonna do, but like this, he's like in power right now. I don't really understand why we're talking about future state when anything that comes up, if there's something that Biden wants to do, it's currently within his purview to start doing anything that's required or that he thinks is required. So I would have thought he'd more speak on recapping the things that he's done on specific subjects, but it sounded a lot of forward projection as if he wasn't even the president. And so, this idea that he may be suffering from dementia, that he may be having some other type of, mental situation seems profound. I can't see how it isn't that because I can't understand how, a sitting president would go up there and not be able to deliver a coherent message. So I guess that to me was the first takeaway. The second one was that there were so many interchanges that occurred that just seemed to be nonsensical and not really related to the campaign. Whether, the golf score was a certain thing or whether there was a certain level of, mental or health fitness, like these debates that took place between these two candidates regarding these things just again seem kind of nonsensical. And we have really substantive policy debates that need to occur that I just didn't think were addressed. Whereas when I listened to Kennedy speak about it, he actually answered the question and talked about like policy that he either wanted to put in place or that he was planning to put in place. So my first takeaway was just how profoundly different the answers were from both Biden and Trump, and then listening to Kennedy as far as substance.
Well, so um, you know, listening to Biden, I was not surprised. You know, again, going to my comment earlier that our elected officials need to be communicating back to their constituency. You know, you begin if you're thinking about that, not like I need the strongest man or the smartest man in the position. I think that's where you take a real hit for where you can see like Trump as being very suited, a good candidate, Biden as being very problematic. But in the wake of the debate, like when I see anyone calling for the removal of a president by the 25th Amendment, that is horrifying to me. The chief idea
This is the
behind,
one where the cabinet would remove, right? That's the
yes,
25th.
yes, and they talked about it. You know, Democrats talked about it with Trump all the time. I was disgusted to hear that uh, because again, you know, if you don't like the way that somebody is communicating, then tough. Go vote in the next election. If you don't like policies, go vote in the next election. But don't operate under a expectation that we live under a king. The United States of America, were every one of those states was and the union of those states was every notion goes back to getting away from a king. And if we expect like the United if we expect the like the iron fist of the president, I mean, you know, like listen to the Republicans complaining about, oh my God, war with Russia. War was only authorized under an act of Congress. It doesn't take removing the president to return us to that norm. And we are like in a undeclared war against Russia right now, and involved in many other undeclared and never-ending wars. But that is whether we have a good communicator as president or not. If our expectation is like the decision of one person gets to make that decision, then we have lost our way completely. So
Yeah, yes, I think that the first time when we ever had some of that stuff is when we started to reclassify war as, you know, military actions or like stuff like this. This is why semantics matter, and why language matters, right? It's like, what was a war? Like, I don't think that anybody, you know, in previous days past would have said, if you have a military personnel that are operating on foreign soil, that are engaging in some sort of a military action, that wouldn't have been defined as a war, right? Like redefining these things and saying, well, if it's this, this, and this, then it really doesn't rise to the level of war. Then we make it so that, you know, that term never can have any meaning ever again, and it sort of removes a power from Congress just by redefining a word, so that we don't have to, you know, go through a normal process to allow for, you know, a kingly action to occur and say, I'm going to move troops around and I don't actually have to get congressional approval to do it. That was the whole idea that we could have a slippery slope. I think we lost that because we were always very concerned that, you know, if we took this one step in this direction, that it would lead far down the path. And now it just seems like that is the norm that we do, is just to take these wild actions and allow for it, and then to flaunt or ignore what the written requirements are for certain things.
well, and 100%. And this is also why I think we should be like returning to a paradigm of these elected officials being communicators. And look at what the fight has been over the you know, Biden keeping documents. You know, going back to what the subpoena for Merrick Garland was not issuing the tape of his deposition for that, and the case against Donald Trump for keeping secret documents. Why are any of these documents secret to begin with? because again, if like the logical line of reasoning that we have to have all these secrets, and that one person can be trusted with these secrets, that is not the way that the United States was set up. It was set up to have an open discussion about the decisions of a group of people, and that they should not be morally reprehensible decisions, and something that we weren't ashamed of. And if America has lost its way, it's because we think that de facto there are secrets that citizens can't be trusted with, and that we have international relations that where we do things that we can't admit to, hashtag the CIA, and the coups and the assassinations that have occurred under that body, that even our internal policing force, or that there would ever be a federal police force like the FBI. Those to me are the true problematic things, and we are at fault. Not any one president. We are at fault because we've allowed this notion of secrecy and might to rule our political discourse, and I think it's a big problem. But
so you mentioned you had a couple of takeaways as far as things in the debate. So I sort of brought it up to a high level. I thought some other interesting takeaways was he said that he was going to cut the federal defense spending by 50%. That was a big commitment. I mean, that is not an insignificant amount to cut the defense budget. Like that was surprising. Not to say the least, but that's the first thing that I heard. That was a significant policy mention that Kennedy said. I didn't.
I mean, and a wonderful idea it is. His uncle created the Peace Corps. The real success coming out of World War I was the Marshall Plan.
Well, wait a minute. Now, as far as kings go, like the president is I don't think the president can do that, right? The budget is not set by the president. It's supposed to be set by the Congress, but we haven't really been operating under that in a long time. I remember when the Congress was supposed to bring a budget forth. We don't even do that anymore, right? We just raise the debt ceiling every year.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't. We also have this discussion about like debt, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody cares how much.
No. Hold on. Let's stay on this for a second. Can you even do that? Because we're talking about King, so let's tie this one back in. Like, can Kennedy even do it?
He can change. He can change where a lot of these agencies come from the FBI to the EPA, et cetera, come under the discretionary budget of the president, and the budget.
Right, they're all under the executive branch, so a lot of this stuff does fall to the executive.
And again, but going back to what the president truly can do is recommend cuts and control the narrative, like set the agenda and control the narrative.
But Congress sets the budget. Congress is supposed to be controlling the purse strings. So even though this may be a stated goal that he has, this is not something that he can just deliver by fiat decree. This is not like unless we're really getting into a situation where the presidency has accreted more power than it was supposed to, but this one might not actually be achievable here by the person who said that he wanted to do it.
It's true, but he also has a large amount of authority under the bureaucratic agencies because they are all created under the office of the executive.
Right, and I suppose one thing that could be done is just like, since it's his job to spend the money, he can decline to spend it. So by some amount of decree, they can start to not spend the money that was allocated to them because he controls how the money actually gets spent.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, Congress is allocating money to him, but like if he declines to spend it and returns it to them, they're like, well, we decided we didn't need all that money. That usually doesn't happen, but whatever.
Well, he is the commander in chief, and that is also, we never had by the Constitution, we don't have the notion of a standing army. It was supposed to be called up, and when called up, it was to be under the thumb of the executive. So I think actually he can, Congress can budget trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to them, but then he disseminates that money, and so it would be very interesting to see what he did with regards to the military. There were a couple of other things that he said too that I thought were profound. One, he called out Biden for denying him Secret Service protection, and I thought that was pretty damning. And Biden certainly has denied him Secret Service protection. Uh, I think that is the one of the truest stains on Biden's decisions. He also talked about immigration, and he gave a better defense of the Biden administration's immigration policies than Biden did himself. He said that the Democrats were operating out of humanitarian concerns, but then he went on to describe like why that operating outside of the bounds of Congress and legal immigration was not in the best interest of those people who were entering the country illegally.
I was also really impressed with his statements on the facts that it's not the border that is causing the drug problems and getting the drugs across the border. That wasn't the issue, and he was willing to federally legalize marijuana and use the money from the taxes of federally legalizing marijuana to help with the other drug wars. I thought that was a very interesting take.
Well, and yes, I thought that was also a
because
better.
because that's not even on the radar right now, because what we're talking about with marijuana is not legalizing it, and it hasn't been legalized. What's being discussed is descheduling it, so like we're moving it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, right? So that's not even legalization when we're talking Schedule 3, right?
Well, either way, I think that Kennedy entering into the conversation that it's not about other countries sending drugs to the United States. It's about the citizens of the United States wanting and using those drugs, which is a bigger problem and something that our politicians and political structures should be addressing. And we we're over time, so I don't want to dwell too much on this. But the last thing that I thought was that I really liked that.
Wait, I want to clarify that, because that absolutely is what's happening right now. So like with it being moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it is still criminal. So, essentially what's going on here is even with the proposed way that things are being done, unless something like what Kennedy just described, we're still in a very unstable foundation for what's going on, because essentially what's going on is many people are committing crimes at a federal level, but not at the state level, because there's disagreement here. So this is still in a state of discord with respect to how this is operating. So what Kennedy is saying is more aligning with what is populist in many of the states, because essentially we have decriminalized it at the state level, but we do not have a accord between the state and the federal level. So Kennedy is saying, hey, I want to normalize this according to the way that we're thinking about this, and in most of the states would align and bring in likely significant tax revenue to the federal government.
Well, but Kennedy also talked a lot about getting a generation that has not had access to the American dream. I mean, what is freedom goes back to a notion of home. Freedom comes from the place of Freya, the Norse mother god. And he didn't talk about that, but what he did talk about was a generation of Americans who don't own their own home, and the rest of America who is in debt and paying paying their mortgage to a bank, et cetera, et cetera. And I would think that if you dug down on Kennedy, he would also say that the drug problem that we have in America is because there are people who do not have backyards and homes, who do not have stability, and so instead turn to give their mind, blah blah blah. I don't know. That's so. I just think that Kennedy's like understanding of the problem was much deeper than either of the solutions that Biden and Trump say, which to them there's just like villain, and the villain is China or Mexico. The reason that we have drugs in America is China or Mexico, or maybe if you listen to some of the Democrats, it's because there's a family in New York called the Sacklers. No, it's not. Like I would imagine that Kennedy would say it's because people don't have jobs and they don't have homes and they don't have a reason to enjoy their lives. But the last thing that I wanted to point out that Kennedy did an amazing call out was with regards to Biden's the Biden administration censorship. And the same case that we talked about earlier, the Missouri versus Foley or whatever, that the Supreme Court denied on standing. Kennedy pulled no punches, and he, to me, the most clippable thing that he said from that was his description of the abuses of American rights that had been taken by the Biden administration with regards to censorship and the Trump administration with regards to the COVID response, and an absolute the unprecedented things that were done by the federal government that were not constitutional. So, and those were topics that neither Trump nor Biden wanted to talk about because they both had a problems in their administration in which they did not have the correct policy responses to problems that came to them. So that's all I have to say about the debate, or not all that I have to say, but that's all that I think we have time for. I don't know if you have anything else. I've still got time, but I know we try to keep it here in an hour. So
no, I think this is a good place to end. I think there's more nuance if we want to pick the debate apart and kind of go through the answers and kind of go through it in more depth. It might be fun to do. I wasn't necessarily 100% prepared to go point through point, but if you want to go through it, I think that might be interesting to do. So I'd probably do a bit more of trying to ensure that I watch the entire thing front to end, as well as watching all of Kennedy's, because I just didn't get a chance to do all of that in one shot. So yeah, if we're going to go through that, let me be a little bit more prepped. So I would say maybe we could cover that on Thursday if you want to do it. I think it might be fun to do it.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We could find some clips because there was also like the nuance whenever Kennedy was talking about, this whole notion of, are you better off? Are you better off than your parents? Are you better off than the rest of the world? Kennedy had a very much more nuanced, like what he talked about, like what is your portion? What is your share? And I thought that was a political narrative that led to policies which were concerned about Americans and not concerned about like going out in the world and taking from other countries, which seems to have been how our political discourse has been set up since the 40s. Or maybe since Teddy Roosevelt. I really trash Teddy Roosevelt every chance that I get. So anyway, that's all I got, Grant. I really enjoyed it. I hope that our listeners enjoyed it too.
Yeah, very political discussion today. Not I love doing these ones because I think politics is important. So this is fun.
Well, and crypto is a political movement. So if everyone came expecting crypto and blockchain, everything that crypto is always political. So we'll get back to blockchains and technology too later this week.
I did see that on the topic of cryptocurrency, before we end real quick, I did see that Sony Corporation in Japan is now starting to back cryptocurrency. So now Japan might become pro cryptocurrency.
And meanwhile, more things to add on that table. Germany is still selling Bitcoin. Did you see what Peter Thiel's remarks were with regards to Bitcoin?
I saw the Peter Thiel comments, was a little scattered. It didn't make a ton of sense. Like he was saying some things, and the things he said didn't entirely comport or make sense altogether. So it's like, yeah, I knew about Bitcoin a long time ago. I should have bought more, but I sold it. It's like, what? How does none of that made any sense to me? I didn't understand how those things strung together.
Do you remember when Peter Thiel first came to prominence before Palantir? What Peter Thiel was part of?
Well, I mean, Peter Thiel was part of Facebook. He's an investor, so I mean, he's done a lot of stuff, right?
Well, the first thing that he ever came to my radar was whenever he joined Elon Musk to make PayPal. So Peter Thiel started with internet banking and had a bank, I believe it was called Consensus, Elon was trying to tackle the clearinghouse window for checks, and we talk about clearinghouse with regards to stocks, and like this notion of the check clearinghouse being electronic and the federal government abusing that clearinghouse period of 2 weeks to make seniorage, to pay off some of the federal debt, and that not being fair to taxpayers or citizens of the United States. Peter Thiel and Elon Musk were both on that very early. So I think that I've always thought that Peter Thiel is brilliant, and so I think he was. Well, let's dig more into that's a whole nother conversation. Let's not have that. Let's not start that 10 minutes after the hour. But
yeah, we'll cover it for sure. But yeah, it's a good place to end. So we'll call it good for the day. Thanks a lot, everybody, and see you tomorrow on FOMO.